Hello and welcome to week 10 of my philosophy of mind class that I'm teaching at LaGuardia Community College. My name is Dr. Richard Brown, and this week we'll be talking about contemporary dualism. Now, to some extent, we've talked about dualism a little bit already while introducing the mind-body problem. Excuse me, and we looked at the way that Descartes presented dualism and the 200 years that came after Descartes of people wrestling with causal closure, even up to the point of invoking quantum mechanics as a way to get out of causal closure. We've looked at the identity theory. We've looked at functionalism to some extent. We're still next week going to put that off on talking about computation in a more detailed way and what role, if any, that has in mind and consciousness. But for this week, we're going to revisit the kind of arguments that stem from rationalist positions, and rationalism is, of course, a view in philosophy of epistemology, whereby real knowledge in some sense, you have to explain what that means. Real knowledge comes from reason, according to these people. And contemporary arguments for dualism are all of them based on refinements in modal logic, the logic of necessity and possibility. And the reason it's called modal logic is because necessity and possibility are different modes. And so that's a technical thing. You don't really need to know about it. You just need to know that it's true. And what they aim to do, these new refinements in modal logic, give us a way, or so these dualists think, to make more precise Descartes' claim that we can, quote, imagine the mind without the body. So we looked at that a couple of weeks ago. And, that sounds pretty vague, but these guys think that developments in logic allow us to state this in a more precise way. And in addition to that, we can make more precise the notion of identity and what modal implications identity has. You may recall the identity theorists who we talked about a couple of weeks ago, and they claimed that the mind was identical to the brain and that this was a contingent identity, or in other words, that this identity was true here at the actual world, but it wasn't necessarily true. And so some developments in logic allow us to make very clear what they're saying and to test whether we think that that's true. So that's what I just said. This is important because these guys thought that these identities were contingent. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump right into this stuff. Now, you know me and my predilection for starting at the beginning of things. So Aristotle gets the credit for discovering deductive logic, and he really is putting together the various pieces of the puzzle which were floating around in ancient Greece. And he also gets credit for sort of discovering or initiating modal logic. And he makes several claims about the necessity of certain argument forms and their structures preserving truth, for instance. And, these next several slides, I'm going to kind of take you through a whirlwind tour of some developments in logic up to the point where we get to the contemporary stuff. And, I debated a little bit about whether I should actually do this because some of it is kind of only tangentially related to the main goal here, which is getting to the arguments for dualism. But in my opinion, if you want to know the truth, I think that understanding some of the technical stuff helps you understand the motivations behind these kinds of arguments. So if you don't agree, then you can probably just fast forward this by 15 minutes or so, because I think that's about how long it's going to take to kind of go through this. Okay, so, but if you're sticking with me then, roughly one way of putting Aristotle's idea, and this is an idea which he gets from the people who are doing geometry, and, people like Thales and Plato, and Socrates even was very interested in geometry, clearly. So the idea that's floating around is that knowledge requires a deduction from a finite set of axioms. So axioms are the things which you can't prove, but which are self-evident, or the things which are self-proving in some sense of that word. So that the way that logic proceeds is, according to Aristotle, you take some finite set of things which are self-evident, and then you use those kinds of things to say new and interesting things, extend those things, and what follows from them logically. And so Aristotle is very famous for formulating two of the basic laws of logic, at least what seem to be two fundamental and basic laws of logic. And these are often called the law of the excluded middle and the law of non-contradiction. And these are claims about assertions. So the first one says that it is necessarily the case that assertions are either true or false. So that it's not possible, according to this claim, that there is an assertion which makes a claim about the world, but which is neither true nor false. Aristotle himself puzzled about this because he wondered about the truth value which we give for future sentences. That's a different mode. So one mode is talking about the actual time. Another mode is talking about the future time. So his famous example is of a sea battle. He says, there will be a sea battle tomorrow. Is that sentence true or false? Well, tomorrow's not here yet. So, well, it seems weird to say that it is true because, in some sense, we think of the future as not yet determined. So this is a basic puzzle. And we're not here to dwell on these kinds of logical puzzles, but some people have drawn some interesting conclusions from this kind of puzzle. So we'll just sort of note that. That seems interesting. And then on the other hand, there's the claim that sentences cannot be both true and false. So that's the law of non-contradiction. And here the basic idea is supposed to be that every sentence gets one or the other of these two truth values, and no things which are contradictory are true. And if you know something about this ancient period, then you know that people like Thales and even the other kinds of sophists and other early philosophers like even Parmenides and Zeno are using a method called reductio ad absurdum, whereby you try to show that an opponent's view leads to a contradiction. And so the reason why that works is because of the law of non-contradiction. It says that a sentence cannot be both true and false. So that's very interesting. But notice the kinds of things that he's developing here involve possibility and necessity. He's claiming that it's necessary that every sentence, as you see here, is either true or false, and that it can't be both. So the kind of logic that Aristotle develops is what's known as syllogistic, categorical syllogistic logic. And the reason for that is because he studies the argument structures which have two premises and one conclusion. So here's a standard form representation of a categorical syllogism. It says all A's are B's, all C's are A's, so all C's are B's. The line there indicates a conclusion is being drawn from those two. Oh, shoot, I just spilled some water. Sorry. It indicates that a conclusion is being drawn from those two premises. So that's very interesting, and we could say a lot of stuff about syllogisms and how you form them, and we won't. But right after Aristotle develops this, another kind of logic is developed called propositional logic. And propositional logic is interesting because it takes not categories of things, like the things which are mortal or the things which are dogs, like groups of objects, but rather sentences. So you say, if it's raining in New York City, then I should bring an umbrella when I go outside. It is not the case that I should bring an umbrella when I go outside, so it is not the case that it is raining in New York City. That happens to be modus tollens. And this argument structure was discovered in the very early period after Aristotle by a person named Chrysippus, I think. And that's all very exciting. But really what's interesting for us is that Aristotle's talking about necessity and possibility. And he's claiming that these kinds of argument structures, it's necessary that they're valid. It's impossible that they're invalid. He's making these kinds of claims. But in order to do that, you have to distinguish between several kinds of possibility and necessity. So one kind is what we might call nomological possibility. And that simply means a nomological coming from the Greek word for law, nomos. So possible given the laws of physics. So as a matter of fact, as it happens, human beings can't fly by flapping their arms. So the laws of physics, and especially the way the law of gravity works, which we talked about in a previous lesson actually, the inverse square law, and given the way things work around here and the mass of the earth and so forth and so on, we just can't do that. That's impossible. But clearly, there seems like there is a sense in which it's possible that human beings fly by flapping their hands. Not the sense in which the laws of physics would allow it, like it's possible that I could get up and walk to the bathroom right now, which I won't do, but that's That's a nomological possibility, whereas the other one is not. So we want to distinguish something like what's called a metaphysical possibility, which is just to say that, it seems like our world could have worked out to have been this way. And many people feel that even though the laws of physics are the way they are, many people have this feeling like they could have been different. The world could have turned out differently. So, if you recall the inverse square law, it says the force of gravity is equal to the gravitational constant, g, times the masses of the objects multiplied divided by the distance between them squared. So you say to yourself, that's interesting, that's an inverse square law. Why can't it be an inverse cube law? Why isn't it the force of gravity equals g times m1, m2 over r cubed? It's not that way, but it seems like it could have been. Doesn't seem absurd or contradictory to say that the world could have been like that. Now, we can imagine all kinds of variations. Why can't it be 2g times m1, m2 over r squared? Why not, the square root of g to the fourth times cosine theta? I mean, you could make up all sorts of stuff. It's not that way, but it seems like it could have been that way. We'll call that metaphysical possibility in the class, especially in this lecture. Now, we need to distinguish that from another sense of possible and necessary. So each one of these, you can say, this thing is necessary according to the laws of physics. You could say, this thing is necessary according to metaphysics. Or you might be talking about something epistemological, which, what's possible given what we know is a loose way of cashing that out. And for our purposes, we'll simply talk about the way the world might be given what we know. For all we know, it might be like this. And I think a more intuitive sense of epistemic possibility is that we're simply wondering about, like, which ways could a world be made? Not like our world and the way that it is, how could it have changed, but just in general, sort of abstracting away from our world. Which ways can worlds be? That we might call epistemic possibility, and you could imagine all sorts of ways that worlds could turn out to be. And of course, there are all sorts of finer grained distinctions to be made here. Like, for instance, we might wonder about, is it, conceivability or possibility or necessity with respect to me, or with respect to a given theory, or with respect to a certain background, or just in general. So there are various things to iron out here, and these are the kinds of things that we want to keep our eye on. And what we're going to trace over the next few minutes is a kind of, tracking down of these various notions, especially the notion of metaphysical and epistemic possibility. So we've got to distinguish here what sometimes gets called logical possibility, which is simply the idea of something being contradictory or not. So people might say, look, it's logically impossible that there are square circles. It might be epistemically impossible, like for all you know, if you don't know enough about geometry, you might be able to work yourself into thinking, yes, given what I know now, maybe this is possible, but, it's not metaphysically possible maybe. And so people use these words in different ways, as usual. You have to be aware that one of the sad things here is people just use words in whichever way they feel like. But we're trying to define these, and we're going to use these words in a consistent way here. So I won't really talk about logical possibility. I'll talk about metaphysical possibility and epistemic possibility, and in particular talk about them this way. So we can say over here on the right-hand side, it's clearly metaphysically necessary that modus tollens and categorical syllogisms and so forth are valid arguments. That's supposed to be the idea, that it's not even possible that the world could have turned out that these were invalid. It's probably not even logically possible that these things turn out to be invalid. So this seems to be the most severe kind of necessity and impossibility associated with logical notions. Okay, so this is relatively, simple working out. And that's, Aristotle and then Chrysippus and these people. This is 400 years or so before year one. And then, 1,000 years or so goes by. And so here's 1800. Now, if 400 before year one, and then 1800, you can see that this is over 2,000 years later. Then Kant says this, quote, "Since the time of Aristotle, logic has not had to go a single step backwards, unless we count the abolition of a few dispensable subtleties, or the more distinct determination of its presentation, which improvements belong more to the elegance than to the security of that science. What is further remarkable about logic," continues Kant, "is that until now it has been unable to take a step forward, and therefore seems to all appearance to be finished and complete." End quote. So 2,000 years later, Kant thinks, look, you can't improve on those notions. We've done everything we can with logic. We've worked out as much as we can about the concepts of necessity and possibility. And of course, you know that as soon as someone says something like that, it's a matter of time before that's going to be falsified, or maybe. And so here's where we really start to get to what we're supposed to be talking about here. And so C.I. Lewis gets the credit for inventing or discovering modern symbolic logic. Symbolic modal logic. And so here, what you do is you introduce two new symbols. So whereas before we introduced a symbol for the universal quantifier, and we introduced a symbol for the existential quantifier, now we're going to introduce symbols for modal notions of necessary and possible. And the square is typically used to represent necessary, and the diamond is typically used to represent possible. So that sentence right there says it's necessary that P, if and only if, it's not possible that not P. And so you can interdefine these two things in the same way. And so Quine was a very important American philosopher, taught at Harvard for a very long time. He died in the year 2000. And I remember being a grad student in my first year in grad school and reading in the obituary section that Quine died. And I knew who he was kind of, but I didn't really know who he was. And then I found out later that was quite a tragic thing and a great loss for the philosophical community. But nonetheless, Quine was very suspicious of modal logic. He called it born of sin, and that it was he did not like it. No, but why? Well, so here's a kind of problem, which is, I don't think this is exactly the way he puts it, but it's sort of coming out of some stuff he's writing about in the 1950s and 1953 in particular. So consider these following sentences. This is an argument. So the first sentence says, "It is necessary that 8 is even." That seems true. It's necessary. The second sentence says, "The number of planets is 8." That seems true. In our world, there are 8 planets. We used to think that there were 9, but Pluto got the boot, and it's merely a planetoid body out there in that big asteroid thingamabob, the whatever it's called, not the Kepler belt, but whatever that thing is out there with all them planetoid masses floating around, and so Pluto's out there. But now we know there are 8 planets. The number of planets is 8. It is necessary that 8 is even. Therefore, can we conclude that it's necessary that the number of planets is even? Well, this is getting weirder and weirder. We're proving strange results, it seems like, left and right. How doesn't seem like it's necessary that the planets have that number. It seems easily different. In fact, we just sort of realized that we used to think it was 9, and then now it's 8. And you might say, well, that's merely an epistemic thing. It was always 8, but it doesn't seem like it's necessary. Seems like there really could have been 9 planets. The way Quine puts this, and this is the point that he makes in this 1953 paper, is that when you talk about modal logic, you have introduced an intentional context. That, notice the big S there. So if you remember our discussion about intentionality versus extensionality, and that's not the same thing as intentionality, namely being about something. And this is forever a confound in philosophy, but oh well, that's the way it works. An intentional context is one where when you substitute things with the same reference, you don't get the same truth value. So, we talked about that before. That was, we called it opacity or intentional. So if you put water as H2O, that's true. That identity is true. But, if you believe that water is wet, you might not believe that H2O is wet for various reasons, like, whatever they are. but intentional contexts are one where you put in co-referring terms and you change the truth value. So here it looks like, the number of planets and the number 8, it seems like they co-refer. Those two phrases pick out the same thing. They both pick out the number 8. But yet you substitute them in and you get this kind of problem. So it just seems like it's a disaster. And so things roughly stood until Saul Kripke came along, and I wouldn't say he really gets the full credit for this, because people like Ruth Barkin Marcus, like I previously mentioned, she was thinking about these issues, and so were other people. Schmolian was one of, there's tons of them, and it doesn't really matter, but I happen to have studied with Kripke, and so I know a lot about his work, and I think a lot of people sort of take their start from here. And he's also a unique individual. He shows the kind of solution to this problem when he's 17, and this paper's published when he's 19, in 1959, A Completeness Theorem in Modal Logic. And what he does is to sort of take a page from history and invoke the concept of a possible world. And this actually comes from Leibniz, who we met a long time ago in this class. And Leibniz is someone who talks about possible worlds and claims this is the best of all possible worlds, and that's interesting. But we're sort of going to ignore that. So Kripke is not talking about in those terms. He wants to introduce the notion of possible world semantics. So you simply introduce the notion of a possible world. A possible world is simply stipulated to include certain individuals, and those individuals have certain properties. And then you treat necessarily P as claiming that something is true in all possible worlds. So now you have a way to connect this abstract notion to something that makes sense. And here's a kind of loose analogy or way of putting things, which a lot of people find conducive to helping them understand it. So we know what the sentence P and Q means. We talked about that in a previous lecture as well, in the functionalism lecture. So P and Q is simply true when both of the P and the Q parts are true and false in the other cases. So that's interesting. And then you can think of universal quantification as kind of a giant conjunction. So you take the sentence, all dogs are mammals, and in a way it's like what you've said is, this thing is a dog and a mammal, and this thing is a dog and a mammal, and this thing is a dog and a mammal, and this thing is a dog and a mammal. And that's basically what the sentence for all X, if X is a dog, then X is a mammal means. It can be thought of as sort of giving you this giant conjunction, which is true if all of the things in there are the way the sentence says. So it's kind of an analogy to the way conjunction works, and we understand that sort of in truth functional terms. So that gives us a way to understand universal quantification in a simple way. And Kripke has given us a way to think about necessity and possibility in a similar simple way. Instead of thinking as a conjunction of all the particular things which are dogs and there being mammals, we think of, oh, well, this is just a conjunction of these possible worlds. So it is necessary that 8 is even simply means that in every possible world 8 is even. That makes sense intuitively. And of course, you treat possible in a similar way. You treat it as true in at least one of these possible worlds. And that's on analogy with the existential quantifier, which tells you if there exists an X that's a dog and a mammal, that tells you that there's at least one dog that's a mammal. So this is Kripke's idea. You introduce these possible worlds. These things have individuals in them and their properties, so you kind of stipulate that, and you might think that's interesting, but Kripke is very clear that at least on his way of approaching things, possible worlds are not real objects. You can't see them through a telescope. You can't find the possible world where water is XYZ. You simply stipulate that in this world, water is XYZ. So you write down some sentences like, in this world, there are these things, and you list out all of those things. And Kripke has a very simple kind of metaphor in his mind where he thinks about, like when you roll a dice. Excuse me, when you roll a die, if you want to enforce that rule, that the word dice is plural, and so therefore die is singular. When you roll the die, it comes up a 4. It seems like it could have been a different number. So there's a possible world where it came out 1. There's a possible world where it came out 2. There's a possible world where it came out 3. There's a possible world where it came out 5. And 6 if it's a 6-sided die. So that's fine. Now those possible worlds are not like places that you can go and visit according to Kripke, but they're sort of ways the world could have been. And we can sort of think about them. We understand what it means that the world could have been like that. It simply means that we can write down, oh, here are the ways it could have been. It could have been 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Which one was it? 6. So it's actually 6, but it could have been any one of these things. And of course, that's tied to the way this particular die actually is. So we're not going to go too far down this road of talking about the metaphysics of possible worlds, because for us, we're just talking about, this is a logical tool to help us understand what we mean when we say this is necessary or that is possible. We're talking about, well, if it's necessary, we're claiming it's true in every possible way the world could have been. And if we're saying it's possible, then we're saying it's true in at least one way the world could have been. And if we're saying it's actually true, then we're saying it's true with the way the world actually is. So in the other lectures, when we talked about this stuff in intentionality, we talked about rigid designation. So rigid designation really shines when you talk about possible worlds. So according to Kripke, you can rigidly designate an object by saying, I want to talk about that particular thing. A rigid designator picks out the same object in every possible world that it designates at all. So take, for instance, the English name Saul Kripke. Well, Saul Kripke designates a certain particular individual. I showed you a picture of him earlier. So we want to pick out that guy. So we pick him out. And we want to know, okay, so is it possible that he might not have been a philosopher? So could the world have turned out such that Saul Kripke, that particular individual, wasn't a philosopher? And, it seems like, yeah, I can find that possible world fairly easy. Here it is. He's very smart. He hears about philosophy. He thinks it's boring. He's much more interested in dancing, and he goes and becomes a dancer. Okay, now that's not how it actually turned out, but maybe we can imagine he met a very influential dancer, and this person convinced them. I mean, you could tell a whole long story about this. It seems possible. And it's that particular individual who might not have been the philosopher. So in this other possible world, Saul Kripke, that guy, is a dancer. And we can just notice the first thing here. We just stipulate Saul Kripke, in this possible world, he's not a philosopher, he's a dancer. And so that sentence, we can understand what it means. There is a possible world where he doesn't turn out that way. But now look at the converse. When you have two rigid designators there, it seems like you get a different result, or at least Kripke thinks this. And this has been very influential. So if you think about the sentence, Saul Kripke might not have been Saul Kripke, it doesn't seem like you can find that possible world. Where's the possible world where this particular guy turns out not to be that particular guy? Like even in the world where he's a philosopher, he's still that guy. Even in the world where, he has radically different properties, like where everything about him is sort of different. His height, his weight, his attitudes, his beliefs. Well, it's still the same guy, you might think. We pick him out. So this second sentence here, it seems like it's necessarily false, whereas the first one is possibly true. And so rigid designation gives us a tool which we can use to solve this problem that came from Quine, which we just were talking about a second ago. So you remember our two sentences here down at the bottom, and I've sort of regimented them a little bit. I haven't really wrote them symbolically, but I put them a little bit more closer to the symbology. So necessarily that would be replaced by a square, and then you would symbolize the sentence over there in some way, but we don't need to do that. So now up above us, I'm going to stipulate some possible worlds. So these 12 worlds represent all of the possible worlds in my universe I'm going to talk about. There are no other possible worlds. So I'm just stipulating that. Now, the numbers there, 1 through 12, indicate how many planets there are in those possible worlds. So in possible world 1 there's just 1 planet. In possible world 2, there's 2 planets. In possible world 3, there's 3 planets. Okay, and the number sign there is supposed to indicate that there are numbers in those possible worlds. So now that's all that exists, numbers and these planets. And, so I'm simplifying just to make this easy. So let's take our second sentence here. Necessarily the number 8 is even. So remember, Kripke has told us that we interpret that sentence to tell us that it is true in every possible world that the number 8 is even. And we're just considering this local group of possible worlds here. And in fact, it is true, reasonably, you might say, that the number 8 is in fact even in every one of those possible worlds. In world number 1, 8 is even. In world number 2, 8 is even. Right? That seems intuitively true because the number 8, that's really a name. It's got, sounds like a description, but it's really a name for this number. And it's rigidly picking out the same object in every world. 8 is 8 in every possible scenario. So it doesn't even seem like you can imagine 8 being odd. There are no possible worlds where 8 is odd, right? Okay. Now, but notice that first sentence, the number of planets is even. Well, Kripke says, that sentence actually has a description in it. And descriptions don't rigidly designate. Descriptions simply pick out whatever happens to satisfy the description in the relevant world that you're looking at. So, for instance, take world number 2 there. Well, in that world, the number of planets is even. So if we're thinking about that world, then that sentence is true. But now look at the next world over. In that world, the number of planets is odd because there's only 3 there, or 1, depending on which way you move. So in that world, the sentence, the number of planets is even, is false. So therefore, the sentence, necessarily the number of planets is even, is false. It is not true in every possible world that the number of planets is even. So what we've just given is given a model. This is what's called a model. A model is a way of setting up possible worlds, the way of specifying a universe, which makes a certain interpretation of these sentences come out to be true or false or what. And here we've shown that one of these sentences doesn't imply the other. Quine thought that these things co-referred, and so therefore you could switch them in and change the truth value of this thing, but co-referring terms shouldn't do that. Kripke's solution is, well, one of the co-referring terms is a rigid designator, and so picks out the same thing everywhere, whereas the other one is not. Now that's the result, because Kripke wants to now use this to argue that the early identity theorists that we talked about are just wrong in the way they approach this problem. So let's recall our favorite example. Remember, UT Place talked about lightning being electrical discharge, and he used that as an analogy with the brain being identical to pain. A pain being identical to some particular brain state. And his idea was, well, look, you can't see the electricity in the lightning, so you have to do a lot of science and a lot of theory has to inform your decision here. And so that's kind of similar to how it is with the brain. We can't really see the consciousness in there, but our best theory is that we should identify these things. And he claimed, and a lot of these guys claimed, that these identities were contingent, which means not necessary, that it was possible that they be false. Now, Kripke wants to use his rigid designation apparatus here that we've just been talking about to argue that these identity theorists have got it all backwards, that they can't say that. His claim is that if you have two rigid designators, then it seems like the identity is necessary just on considerations of logic alone. So for instance, if A equals B, then it's necessarily the case that A equals B. And the way Kripke puts this is, so which pair of objects could you find which would make it the case that here they are the same object, but in some other possible world, they are different objects? Just seems like that's contradictory. If you're telling me that there's only one object, then it seems like it's always going to be just one object. Now, of course, these identity theorists thought that they had an analogy here, which from other kinds of identity claims, which turn out to be contingent. So here's one we can look at. This one says, Steve Jobs is the inventor of the iPhone. Let's just assume that is in fact true, that he invented the iPhone. Whether it is or not, I don't know. Maybe it was a comedian. I really honestly don't know. So even if it is true, it seems like it's contingent. It seems like we could imagine a case where someone else invented it. This is easy to imagine. There's Bill Gates there. Bill Gates invented the iPhone. He's in his bedroom. He comes up with this brilliant idea. He's going to call it the IPC phone, and the IPC or something. And there's Steve Jobs. He hears about this great idea, and he conks Bill Gates on the head, gives him a roofie, so he has amnesia, and then builds the iPhone instead of the IPC. Bill Gates never remembers. That seems possible. I'm not saying that really happened. I'm saying seems like that there's a possible world where that happens. It seems like that's a possibility. Now, Kripke's point is, well, look here, we got to be careful here because one of the things we have here is a name, Steve Jobs. And Steve Jobs is therefore going to rigidly designate a particular individual. Whereas on the other hand, we have a description, the inventor of the iPhone. And the inventor of the iPhone is not rigid. Frankie doesn't like it when descriptions lose their rigidity in this way, so she barks at them. But the basic point is that it doesn't pick out the same object in every possible situation, since in the possible world where Bill Gates really invented the iPhone and Steve Jobs stole it, then that description will pick out Bill Gates, and the sentence Steve Jobs is the inventor of the iPhone will be false. So some people thought, yeah, okay, isn't this kind of like what's going on in the case of a lightning and electrical discharge? And Kripke's point here is, no, this is not what's going on at all. His claim is that real contingent identities work like this. On one side of the identity, there's a rigid designator. On the other side, there's a description. But when we talk about lightning and electrical discharge, it doesn't seem like it's like that. It seems like we have two rigid designators, according to Kripke. And a lot of people find this plausible. So it seems like lightning is a kind of, almost like a name for that stuff over there. And so it's going to pick out that stuff in every possible world. But also it seems like electricity is like that too. Electricity is a rigid designator. It picks out the same stuff. And maybe you could quibble about this, but it seems intuitively right. And if that stuff really just is electricity, then it does seem intuitive that that has to be necessary. How could that stuff be not that stuff? But then what do you say about when we are imagining that something else is doing it? It just seems pretty clear that we can imagine a different kind of case where the world turns out such that we go over to that lightning over there and we do some science on it and we discover that it's something else, like heat, like molecules moving around, or we discover that it's something else, like water moving really fast from the sky to the ground. Who knows? But we didn't discover that. So doesn't it seem like, it could have been different? It could have been heat. Kripke's response is no. It could not have been different. Lightning has to be electrical discharge. But what's going on when we imagine that lightning turns out not to be electrical discharge is that we're imagining something which looks like lightning but isn't. You might call it fool's lightning. It presents the same appearances as lightning without being lightning. And I think that we can make common sense out of this. Kripke says you can have a person, they could be in exactly the same position, epistemically speaking, being presented with the very same kind of appearance properties as someone who is in the position of seeing lightning, even if they aren't. They aren't seeing lightning because lightning is electrical discharge, and they're seeing something else, but that stuff is causing in them the same kind of experience. Now, I think this happens all the time. I mean, you might say this is hard to get, but think about something simpler. So we know there's fool's gold. I was a kid in California. I found fool's gold all the time. I was so excited. There's gold in them there hills, I said to my mother. And of course, there weren't no gold in them there hills. There was iron pyrite in them there hills. Iron pyrite is a different substance. It is not gold. Why isn't it gold? It looks like gold. It's not gold because it's made out of a different stuff. But it looks like gold. Now, of course, we can differentiate it because, it doesn't have the same density as gold, and Archimedes figured that out, and that's exciting. But you can sort of see the point being made here. Gold is gold because of the kind of stuff it is. And if you have something that looks like gold but is made out of a different stuff, you don't have gold. You have fool's gold. Something which could fool you or trick you into thinking that it was gold when it wasn't. So Kripke's idea is in these when we're imagining these scenarios, this situation where there's a person and they see a flash in the sky, but the flash in the sky is really caused by heat or water instead of electricity. Kripke says they're like looking at fool's gold. It's the same. It looks the same, but it's not the same stuff. It's the stuff that makes it lightning. That's what science told us, and that's necessary. So Kripke says that we can discover empirically necessary truths. That's really interesting. Some people wonder, well, why can't the brain be one of those empirically discovered necessary truths? And of course, this is where Kripke makes his big move. The reason is coming out when you think about this kind of case. So suppose, here's the identity theorists that are telling you pain is identical to chemical and electrical activity in the brain. Okay, so Kripke says, let's apply my system here and see what we get. So pain, that seems like a rigid designator. It picks out the property of painful experience, that the experience is phenomenal character and subjective character, that it is painful for me to have it. And that seems like a rigid designator. It seems like wherever there's pain, there's going to be this painfulness. That's that's what pain is. And I'm picking that out. So every possible world where there's pain, there's going to be this thing. Pinch yourself. That thing is going to be there. Now, of course, these people are telling you what that thing is really identical to some activity in the brain. In particular, the electrical and chemical activity of the brain. Now, Kripke says, okay, well, that seems like a rigid designator too. Wherever there's electrical activity, it's going to be this kind of activity. Wherever there's chemical activity, it's going to be this kind of activity. So it looks like what we have here are these two rigid designators are going to pick out the same states in every possible world. Now remember, so the identity theorist might say, yeah, exactly. But it's going to be the case that we think we can imagine one without the other, like Descartes thought. But, now we're finding out, thank you, Kripke, they say, thank you. Now we're finding out that's not right. And of course, Kripke says, no, that's too quick. Because what we have here are two rigid designators. And how do you make sense of our ability to think of one coming apart without the other? So we can have, it seems very clear what Descartes showed us was that it's easy to imagine the pain existing without the body, right? You can imagine a ghost having a pain. The ghost is not a physical thing. It has a pain, though. Whether that's the way the actual world is, it seems conceivable, it seems possible. Seems like you could go the other way, too, though. You could have the brain activity there, and not be generating any pain experience. That seems possible. So how do you explain that? Now, in the other cases, remember, Kripke reminds us, in the other cases, what we did was we appealed to someone who was in the same kind of circumstances that we are in when we experience the thing in question, but who is having it produced in a different way. So remember the lightning case. You see the flash in the sky, but it's really being produced by, heat. And so you're not really seeing lightning. Kripke's question is, does it seem like it's plausible to say the same thing here? Could there be fool's pain? Now think about what that would mean for a second. Fool's pain. Someone who was in my epistemic situation when I experienced pain, but who was not in fact experiencing pain. Somebody who was in my epistemic situation, something which was painful, but not a pain, like the way something can be like the appearance of lightning without being lightning, like something can have the appearance of gold without being gold. Can something have the appearance of pain without being a pain? Kripke says, no. That doesn't make sense to me. If it has the appearance of pain, then it is a pain. So you can't explain the same disconnect that you could in the other case. And of course, you go the other way, it works as well. So imagine now this pain existing. Remember, this is a rigid designator. So we're being told that this pain is a brain state. But it seems like we could have the brain state existing without any painfulness. So then what we're really being told here, Kripke says, is that you could have the pain itself, but without it being painful. And he says that seems to me sort of just like obviously absurd, like obviously not the case. And the reason why that is, according to Kripke, is because you can't make a distinction between the way the pain appears and the way the pain is. He says, look here, isn't it the case that the appearance just is the reality? When we say it appears to me I'm in pain, doesn't that just mean you are in pain? It's not the same thing as when we say it appears to me there's some lightning over there. You might not really be seeing lightning. It could be a hallucination. You could be experiencing something else. But Kripke says, look, the strategy doesn't work here. The strategy doesn't work here. So let's try to look at some pictorial representations of this. So let's say here's the space of possible worlds. Okay, so let's say the corner here is the actual world. That's the world where water is H2O. And you say to yourself, look, is it necessary that water is H2O? Kripke says, yes, it's metaphysically necessary. In any way that the world could have turned out, water is H2O. So I've represented that here by that orangish color. Those are all the ways that the world could have turned out. And all of them have water as being H2O. So now what do you say about these blue things over here? Well, Kripke says, well, that's where you're imagining something. It's epistemically possible, right? You sort of, for all you know, it could turn out that way, it seems to you. But it's not metaphysically possible, says Kripke. It could not really have turned out that way. So Kripke says, well, there's a disconnect between what's a priori and what's necessary. There are empirically discovered necessities about the way the world has to be that we can't find out except by doing some science, right? We couldn't tell a priori that water was H2O. It would seem to us it could have been lots of stuff. But in fact, it turns out that it has to be H2O. And so, now we know that it's H2O. These other things are conceivable epistemic possibilities, but not real metaphysical possibilities, says Kripke. There's no way the world could really have turned out that way. And so, whereas these other ones, we make it, so what's the difference between the orange H2O world and the blue XYZ world? Well, Kripke says one is possible and the other is not. It seems like it's possible, though. And the reason for that, says Kripke, is because you're imagining somebody being in the same position as you. So you explain away its possibility. No, you're mistaken. You're really thinking this other thing. There's stuff that looks like water, but it isn't really water. So what you really said is there's stuff that looks like water, but it isn't really H2O. And water, it has to be H2O. That's necessary. So you can explain that. Now, Kripke's point here is, look, that doesn't work with the pain and the brain state. Because if you want to say down here at the bottom, right, I should have wrote that down there where you say pain, brain state, and then on the right blue corner right there, you would say, pain without the brain state, something like that. Kripke says you can't do that because there's no way, according to him, that you can drive a wedge in between the appearance of the pain and its painfulness and the pain itself. So you cannot appeal to someone in the same epistemic situation as someone in pain, but who isn't in pain. And, that's very interesting, but that's his argument that why they can't be identified, because they operate differently, modally. You cannot explain. So in the other cases, the identity is necessary. It appears to be contingent, but you could explain it away. In the case of the mind-brain identities, though, Kripke says, it appears contingent, and you cannot explain it away. So the conclusion he draws from that is that it really is contingent. It really is the case that the mind and the brain come apart. So that's Kripke's modal argument in a nutshell. And there were many arguments that are related to that, but they all sort of roughly make the same move, appealing to what's conceivable, and then inferring from that something about what's possible. And, I think David Chalmers' work is really good in this area. And so I wanted to just mention a couple of these other arguments, because what Chalmers does is to take a lot of these different arguments, unite them under one kind of consideration, relate them to Kripke's argument that we just give, and then show how you can kind of expand and refine that to get around some moves. So let's start going through that. So here I think is his most basic and general argument. Physical science explains structure and function. That's the first premise. And that seems reasonable. What science does is tell us how things are related to each other, what kind of structures things have. We explain water in terms of the structure of H2O molecules forming lattices. We explain liquidity in terms of the function of, attraction and repulsion that you get in various forces in the ions and so forth. So, that seems to be what science is doing. The second premise is a statement of the hard problem of consciousness. It says explaining structure and function does not suffice to explain consciousness. So that's, the epistemic claim, that there's no explanatory link here. And so he concludes from that, physical science doesn't explain consciousness. Now, if you think like Chalmers does, and we talked about this when we talked about functional reduction, if you think like Chalmers does, that in order to make something turn out to be physical, you have to sort of be able to explain it in terms of function and structure, then you can get an argument for dualism out of this argument. But you have to add that extra premise. You have to add this bit about functional reduction, and that's a big claim. So I'll point that out. I do think this is the most general version of the argument, though. This plus his views about what it means to be reducible give you the claim that consciousness can't be physical. Now, here's another sort of very famous argument that you find people banding about, and this is the inverted qualia argument. And so the basic idea here is that it seems possible that you could have, two people who were sort of exactly alike in terms of structure and function, and all looking at the same object, the same apple, let's say, and one of these subjects experiences what we would call red, while the other subject experiences what we call green, and these subjects are both, functioning right, and they agree that it's called green, let's say. And this argument in some sense goes back to Locke, but it basically just is a result of the fact that, consciousness is private, and I can't really know what you're experiencing, so it seems possible that it could kind of come apart this way. And of course, then, the conclusion is, well, but, if it really is possible that they come apart in this way, then they're not the same thing. Because if you could have the very same brain state, but that be associated with the opposite experience, then the brain state doesn't seem to be determining or explaining or in doing anything related at all to the conscious experience. And I mentioned, by the way, inverted qualia arguments simply because, the next argument, we're going to talk about the zombie argument, has the advantage of making all this stuff clear. But some people think, oh, it talks about zombies and therefore, it's kind of lame. I think zombies are cool, but, people think, oh, zombies, okay, roll your eyes. But the inverse stuff, I think, makes a little bit more intuitive sense, and that's really all you need. But the zombie argument, I think, really makes all this stuff super explicit. So it's a simple argument. The first premise says that it's conceivable that you have a physical duplicate of you, but that doesn't have consciousness. And so we represent that as P and not Q. P stands for the physical part of you, so there's all of that there. And the not Q stands for in the not qualitative or not qualia, no consciousness. So it seems like that's possible, right? That's what Kripke was talking about, remember. Kripke says, seems like you can have the ghost with consciousness, and it seems like you could have the physical thing without consciousness. And Chalmers wants to use that same kind of consideration. He's going to refine it, though, and make it a little bit more technical. But the conclusion there is that either physicalism is false or consciousness is fundamental. And we're going to come back to fundamentalism about consciousness when we, towards the end of this lecture. By the way, we're almost done. I know this is going on, but we're almost to the point where we can give the most general argument here. So here's the knowledge argument, and this one comes from Jackson. We have to mention this because a lot of people like this. Now, this one talks about a possible world. Let's put it in terms of a possible world where there's a colorblind scientist. And let's say, it's like, Mary is Einstein's cousin in this possible world. And she's colorblind, but she knows all the physics. She knows everything there is to know about physical red, but she's colorblind, so she doesn't know what it's like to see physical red. That's the intuition a lot of people have. If you've never seen it, you can know as much as you want about the brain, but that's not the same thing as seeing it. So now let's imagine that, she does some neuroscience on herself and corrects her color blindness. Maybe someone flew to this planet and said, wow, look at all these colors. And she realizes, what do you mean? What colors? So she corrects her color vision and she suddenly sees red for the very first time. Well, many people feel like, aha, she's going to learn something. And what she's going to learn is what it's like to see red. But now notice she knew everything there was to know about physical processes involved in seeing red. So it seems like knowing that stuff is not the same as knowing what it's like to see red. And many people think, well, then that means there's more to the physical. There's more to consciousness than the physical. So all of these arguments kind of have the same structure. They start from something that's conceivable or which seems conceivable, and they move to something which is possible. So they say, look, there's a possible world out there, and it's a way that the world could have been. So therefore, consciousness comes apart. But if you look at this picture, you might start to get a sneaking suspicion here. All of this is based on, us thinking that these things are in the red area here, ways the world could have been. What if you're in general suspicious about this stuff and you think, look, you can imagine that stuff, but how does that show you that the world could have been like that? Maybe you can say, look, what Kripke showed us is that, look at the XYZ world up there. What Kripke told us is that that world's not possible. Conceivable, but not possible. Epistemically, given everything we know about the world, we can't rule it out. But given what we know about the world from science, it can't be that way. So some people said, and Ned Block is a fierce proponent of this kind of response, some people say, well, look, Kripke, you've shown us the solution here yourself to your own puzzles. And by the way, to all the arguments against dualism, all of the ones we just breezed through. If, in fact, the brain and mind are identical here, then Kripke told us that's a necessary thing. So any way the world could have turned out, it's going to be identical. So let's assume, maybe we'll discover that, like we discovered water is H2O. Maybe we'll just postulate it in order to get some explanations. That's Bloch's idea. But either way, if it's identical, then it's here in this red part. And all of this blue area out here is simply stuff that's conceivable but not really possible. And so maybe that's where the zombie world is. Maybe the zombie world's one of those blue worlds, not one of the red worlds. And if it's one of the blue worlds, then yeah, it doesn't matter. It's not a candidate for the way our world could have turned out. Maybe the Mary world is also a blue world. Maybe the qualia invert world is a blue world. And if so, then what this means, and you can say, thank you, Kripke, what this means is that what's conceivable, what's a priori, is not a good guide to what's necessary or to what's not necessary. Right? This is just Kripke. You told us it seems like we can conceive of water not being H2O, but then you reminded us, no, you can't do that. You contradict the logical notion of identity, which is required that it's necessary. You're really conceiving of something that looks like water, but not. And so maybe that's what's going on here. Not a real possibility. So you shrink the possible worlds. You say, look, there's not all these possible worlds out there. There are some which seem like they're possible, but really aren't. So the metaphysically possible world is smaller. It's a subset, says this response. It's a subset of the worlds which are conceivable. So unlike you guys who say, I can conceive of this, therefore it's possible, you're wrong. You can conceive of it, but it's not possible. Now, this is where Chalmers comes in. And the way he puts this in the paper we've been reading, The Foundation of Two-Dimensional Semantics, is as a golden triangle. A golden triangle, by the way, is a triangle with the ratios of the Fibonacci sequence, the very nice golden ratios. And so here's a golden triangle, and you can see this Fibonacci spiral there, so you can see how cool that is. Okay, so now this first connection between reason and modality, Chalmers traces back to Kant. So Kant's the guy who was arguing that what you can know a priori is what's necessary. He really likes that idea. And, Frege is the guy who was telling us that there's a connection between meaning and reason. There's an aspect of meaning which reason has access to. That's, Frege's sense or something like that. And then, interestingly enough, there's also this connection here between meaning and modality, right? Certain sentences seem analytically or necessarily true. And this idea we can trace back to Carnap, and that's what Chalmers does, and that doesn't really matter. Although it is interesting that Carnap, I found out, was a student of Frege's. Okay, so now the idea then that we've been talking about, some of these philosophers come along and say, yes, you see what Kripke did here is he severed this link. He just shattered the golden triangle. Because no longer, Kripke argues, is there this nice connection between what reason tells us, what's conceivable, and the way the world has to be, what's necessary. It seemed like there was this nice connection, and that connection is broken. We have empirically discovered necessary things. And I won't even tell you about the contingent a priori knowable things, like that, the standard meter is 1 meter long. That seems to be a priori, but contingent because, anyway, okay, so blah, blah, blah. But not only that, we have this sever between reason and meaning, because Kripke is telling us that the world is important. The relations between my thoughts and our words and the things out there is determining which things are necessary and which things are possible, and it's not like the meanings of my words, nothing with intentions or anything like that. So this is where things stand until Chalmers comes along. And what Chalmers wants to do is refine Kripke's argument. He sees in there the basic structure of an argument against physicalism that he likes. But he thinks that, this sort of clever move by these physicalists who want to use Kripke's own work against him, he thinks he can get around that. So what he wants to do is restore this golden triangle. And he's going to do that by trying to connect an aspect of meaning back up to reason and have that very same aspect of meaning connect to modality in the right kind of way. And so, nodding his head at Frege, he introduces the notion of an intention, and in particular, two kinds of intentions, primary and secondary. That's why it's called two-dimensional semantics, because we have two dimensions of intentions. A little rhyming for us. So what is a primary intention? Well, think about water. You might think of water simply as the watery stuff. What is that? Well, it's whatever stuff is watery. You know, what does water do? Well, it does some stuff. It falls from the skies. It freezes at 0 degrees. It boils at 100 degrees. It's in rivers. It's in lakes. You know, and you can list off a bunch of stuff about water. So the primary intention of the sentence or word, you can do it for both, of water, is technically a function from a possible world to a truth value. But in particular, it's the possible world considered as an actual way the world is. We'll talk more about that in a second, but let's just put that definition out there. So here's another definition, secondary intention. A secondary intention is a function. It's a function from a possible world considered in a different way, considered as counterfactual to a truth value. So think about water. The primary intention of water is something like the watery stuff. The secondary intention of water is what it actually picks out. That turns out to be H2O. Now you can define kinds of possibility in terms of these things, and we're going to get to that in a second. Now I have a big picture of this coming up in a second, so we can try to put some spatial stuff to this. But for right now, let's just get this out. Here's the lesson from Kripke. Here's the lesson from Kripke. I'm sorry, I just noticed I made a huge mistake in that sentence. It shouldn't say a truly contingent identity. It should say an empirically discovered identity. An empirically discovered identity. I'm very sorry about that. That's a drastic mistake. So ignore that. A truly empirically discovered identity has a contingent primary intention and a necessary secondary intention. Now, interpreting that in the same way we have been, what that means is that the primary intention is going to be false somewhere because it's contingent. It's not necessary. So there's a possible world where it's false. On the other hand, the secondary intention is going to be necessary. What that means is every possible world is one in which it's true. Now, one way of making Chalmers' argument is simply pointing out that that's a very weird way to think about consciousness. It would be deeply strange if consciousness turned out that way. It would be the only thing in the world, in fact, which turned out that way, which makes it very strange. But of course, understanding this slide is difficult. So we want to go through this in a different way, more visually. So let's do this again. Now I'm using different colors here. So I've got orange. I'm using that orange to be like, this is the real world, the actual world. And then we have yellow. I'm using that to indicate that these things are counterfactual worlds relative to the orange world. So, secondary possibility. It tells you, you take your sentence. Here's our sentence. Water is H2O. It says, take the actual world, the way that it really actually is, and freeze it. And then everything else out there, remember, this is just one subset of the space. This is going to be large space. And instead of having, orange and blue, we simply have this. One space, what you can think of in two ways. Take this world. Every other world is counterfactual relative to it. Well, a secondary intention, by definition, is simply a function from possible worlds considered as counterfactual to truth values. You take the actual world and you ask yourself, could the world have turned out like this instead of the way it actually did? So there's the XYZ world. It's in yellow, so we're thinking of it as a counterfactual world. That's not the way the world actually is. we're wondering, could the world have turned out this way? Well, there, water is H2O is necessarily true. So it is true there. And therefore, in that world, there is no water. There's XYZ, and XYZ is over there, but that's fool's water. It looks like water, but it isn't really water. So the necessary secondary intention is necessary, just like it's supposed to be. But of course, we can think about this space of worlds in a slightly different way. Instead of thinking about the H2O world as the real world, we know that's the real world. We discovered it. But there was a time when we didn't know it. And for all we knew, the world could have been this other way. So let's suppose that the XYZ world is the actual world. And then what do we say about our sentence? Well, now we're thinking about the primary intention, because we've changed the way we're looking at this possible world. It's not merely a counterfactual world now. We've put our little special marker on it, and we're saying, look, what would be the case if that were really the real world? If that were the actual world, then what? Well, if that were the actual world, then it would be the case that water was H2O, that water was XYZ. And if water was XYZ, then H2O isn't water. So if you think about, now notice all that we've done is change the way we think about this world. It's the same world. It's got XYZ. XYZ fills the waters and the lakes. If you don't remember our twin Earth world, then you can go back to the intentionality video and look at it. But it's filling the lakes and doing all the stuff that water does around here. You drink it, it's delicious. You put it in a Kool-Aid powder, it turns into Kool-Aid. You use it to make coffee, you take showers in it, all of that stuff. So if you think of that world as a counterfactual world, fixing our world as the actual world, then water is H2O, therefore there's no water at that world. But of course, if you fix that world as the actual world, then there is water there, because water is XYZ there. And so this sentence, water is H2O, turns out to be false there. It turns out to be false there. And of course, it seems like we could imagine, doing this again. So primary possibility has to do with thinking of any given possible world as the real world. So in this case, if water is some other chemical called ANH, then it's false that water is H2O. It's false that water is XYZ. It's true that water is ANH. And necessarily then, in every possible world, water is ANH, the secondary intention of that, in a world considered as counterfactual relative to that one, returns a true value. So you can move these around in this way. And again, we can do this over and over and over again. So notice that all we've done is sort of keep one space of possible worlds, and we've just assigned two different functions. One function takes that world and treats it as though it's counterfactual relative to this other world, which is special, the real world, and returns a function, a truth value. The other function takes the possible world and treats it as though it were the actual world, and then returns a truth function. Primary intention versus secondary intention. You have one space of possible worlds, which is being operated on in different ways. So Chalmers says, now we're in a position to put this all together. So take our sentence, pain is electrical and chemical activity in the brain. Now take the secondary intention, maybe that's necessary. If that's what it is here, then any world considered as a counterfactual world relative to ours is one where it's going to be that way. So this is what they were saying. This is what people like Block say. Yeah, that's right. You see, in the zombie world, the P and not Q world, where there's the physical body doing everything the physical body does, but no consciousness there, that world is, conceivable, but not really, could not have been secondarily in this other sense the way it is. But of course, what Chalmers' point is that we can consider this world in a different way. So unless there's a contradiction in the zombie world, we could simply move our marker over there and point and specialize that one. So if you're really being like Kripke, remember what Kripke showed us, that there are possible worlds where these sentences are false. There was an XYZ world, and in the XYZ world, it was false that water is H2O. So you do the same thing here, Chalmers says. There is a possible world. Now, considered as a counterfactual world, that's right, it's impossible relative to ours. But if you consider it on its own merits, if you take the zombie world as the actual world, then it's one where there's pain, physical stuff, but no pain. That seems to represent a coherent way the world could be, right? And sort of you could picture it this way. Well, God could have put his finger on that world instead of ours. And, you don't have to believe in God for that metaphor to be apt. And if you do believe in God, then great. And if you don't, then you could just think, well, the world could be that way. That's a way to make a world. But notice, if that's a way to make a world, then consciousness doesn't seem to be part of the physical stuff. Because if you could put a world together in such a way that you had all the physical stuff, but no consciousness, then it seems like consciousness can't be physical. And yes, if you take the actual world and reason relative to it, then yeah, this world might be ruled out. But we can see that it's possible in some sense. We're sort of picking it out, unless you can find a contradiction there. So Chalmers is claiming, look, you can't have it both ways. You cannot say, yes, 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 I know. You're imagining this world, but it's not really possible. Because he says if you're careful enough about what you mean by possible, if you mean only possible in this primary sense, then it is possible. And that's enough to show, Chalmers thinks, that consciousness can't be physical at the actual world. So now, if one denies that the zombie world is truly possible, right? If you want to dig in your heels and say, look, no, you're merely imagining something that's not a real possibility for a world. There's no world which you could put together and have it come out like the zombie world. Then you're committed to a deeply inelegant view, Chalmers thinks. You're committed to a view where you have this kind of two-layered view about possibility, right? You have this space of possible worlds, which seems like the epistemically accessible ones, which things are contradictory, which things are not contradictory. And the zombie world lives in there, lives in the non-contradictory area, so you might think. But you have this other space of the way the world really could be or could have been. And Chalmers' point is, look, isn't it much more elegant to think of one total space that you can kind of operate on in two different ways? Why think there's this inelegant shift? Why not a nice golden triangle? Where's the problem with this view? And then if you accept this view, he thinks, well, then you have a nice way of clarifying the argument against physicalism. Because every other physical phenomena seems to work the way that Kripke pointed out. Everything else seems like the primary intention is contingent and the secondary intention is necessary. And also that you can that gives you a way to see why the thing there is the way it is. So if the primary intention of water is the watery stuff, where that means, it plays a certain role in the world you're talking about, falls from the skies, fills the lakes, you drink it. And then you look at a world and you see the stuff there is that's doing that is H2O, then you have a way of reasoning from the primary intention to the secondary intention. And Chalmers claims everything else is like that. And if you dig your heels in here, then it seems like consciousness is the only thing that's brutally identical to something with no explanation or understanding for it. It's the only thing which sticks out in this way. And he just says that's, deeply inelegant. Now, people like Bloch have responded that Chalmers is wrong. That he thinks you can't do this for water as H2O either. And that's a little bit advanced. We'll kind of leave that off because I think you have the flavor of what the argument is supposed to be. And of course, we discussed this in a lot more depth in the class. So what does Chalmers conclude here? He says, look, after all this rigmarole, where do we end up? Well, he says, look, if you really believe that zombies are conceivable and you really don't want, and you find this inelegant view of brute identities just existing without explanation, if you find that unacceptable, then you only have two options. One option is dualism. And we've already seen what happens if you are really, really a dualist. If you're really, really a dualist, then epiphenomenalism is your fate. It doesn't seem like it can be avoided in any reasonable way. But of course, epiphenomenalism is itself like really far out. Now, that doesn't mean it's false. It just means that if there's any possible way to avoid it, we should try to avoid it. And Chalmers says, yeah, maybe if we have to, we could defend it, but we don't want to defend it. We want to be able to figure out some way for consciousness to have a causal role in the world. So he says, well, there is another way to do that, and that's to invoke some kind of panpsychism. Now, panpsychism in general is simply the claim that consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality, sort of like a basic element of reality, on the level of things like, mass and spin and charge. Now, this view has a long history, but the contemporary version of this is sometimes called Russelian Monism. And it's called Russelian Monism because Bertrand Russell, in a book of his called The Analysis of Matter, presented a certain view. And so here's a quote from David Chalmers in a paper of his, which is not out yet, but which is coming out soon, and on panpsychism. And he says, quote, Russelian Monism. The view takes its name from Russell's insight in The Analysis of Matter and other works, that physics reveals the relational structure of matter, but not its intrinsic nature. According to this view, classical physics tells us a lot about what mass does. It resists acceleration. It attracts other masses, and so on. But it tells us nothing about what mass intrinsically is. So the equations are describing these interactions between something that has mass, something that has charge. But what is that thing? Physics is silent on that. You might, shades of Kant's noumena may be jumping to your mind here, the thing which physics is describing but leaves out. And here the suggestion is from Chalmers that, maybe the intrinsic nature of mass is phenomenal consciousness. Maybe at the basic ultimate level, consciousness is a part of reality in the most fundamental sense. Maybe what mass is phenomenal consciousness. Maybe phenomenal consciousness is the thing which results in us observing masses interrelating in the way that our physics describes them. Now, this is a very strange view, but notice it solves some problems. It accounts for zombies, because remember, the zombie world is just a world where you take away consciousness. So according to this Russelian monism view, what you've done is basically you have all the structure and function, but without the intrinsic properties underneath. No phenomenal properties. So you've just subtracted them and left all the structure and function there. Like maybe plucked it out. And so you get and that doesn't threaten the view. So whereas it threatens physicalism, because if all you think is the structure and function, you can have that without consciousness. But it doesn't threaten this view because it doesn't seem like you can have consciousness without consciousness. So you get around the problem there. Now, on the other hand, it seems like it avoids epiphenomenalism. Why? Remember, mass has causal properties. If something has a certain kind of mass, that gives it causal powers. If what mass really is in intrinsic nature is phenomenal consciousness, then phenomenal consciousness has causal properties too, has causal powers. So Chalmers thinks that this is a way of solving the epiphenomenalism problem. It's a way of saying, look, there's no problem here. Phenomenal consciousness is doing something. Look at what's going on in the brain. There's electrical activity in there. Well, if electrical charge is really fundamentally constituted by consciousness, then consciousness is doing a lot in the brain. And if the brain causes behavior, then consciousness causes behavior. Now, while it's clearly not like your standard kind of physicalism, in a sense, it preserves it. If you hearken back to our lecture about the electric field, and electromagnetism, and many people thought that this was a strange and spooky entity, which now has become a fundamental feature of our physical explanations. So, you have to posit something, phenomenal consciousness, which is not itself a standard physical property like mass or charge. Doesn't sound like physicalism. But in a sense it is, because you preserve this idea that there's only one kind of stuff in the world. And that kind of stuff ultimately constitutes everything around us. It's the ultimate nature of the physical. And so one common sense idea is, look, what physical stuff is just this stuff. I knocked on a table there. Well, if that's what physical stuff is, and if you do some science and you realize that that stuff is made up of electrons, and you realize that electrons are really fields of a certain kind, and you realize, aha, well, really what electrons in their intrinsic nature is consciousness, then that is consciousness. Seems like you've preserved at least the spirit of physicalism. Now, currently, there are some issues here. Now, besides this anti-common sense view, I mean, it is anti-common sense. But of course, the problem here is we're dealing with a really hard problem, which is how do we fit consciousness into the world in such a way that it makes a difference in the world and we can understand it. So this is an attempted way out. We fit it in by just saying it's fundamental. We don't need to explain it in terms of other things. We explain other things in terms of it. Now, of course, one of the big issues here is something called the combination problem. And one way of getting at that is, look, how do you get a unified experience of me in the world observing one unified scene, what we called before the unity of consciousness? How do we get that from a bunch of, elementary micro phenomenal properties? One way to put that is, how is big experience made out of small experience? And that's a hard question. We don't know the answer. How do you combine a bunch of tiny little things and get a bigger unified subject? Now, some people think, well, that's a question, but it's not as big of a problem as trying to explain how consciousness just shows up out of nowhere. So this would be like Galen Strawson's argument. You don't just get brute identity of emergence at a high level. You have to sort of explain how something emerges from its basic constituents. So here, at least, we have something like an agenda. We can explain how giant conscious experiences emerges from little ones. But we're explaining something on a continuum that's the same, conscious experience giving rise to conscious experience. We're not explaining something that seems radically to shift physical things bumping into each other, electrically activating each other, all of a sudden, bang, 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 consciousness. Now, of course, there are other versions of panpsychism. This is not the only version, Russelian Monism. This just happens to be one that seems to be interesting and to preserve, to sort of get the best of all these worlds. So some people think if you really are moved in this direction by these arguments, look, personally speaking for myself, I don't find them all that moving, but lots of people do. And I've tried to present them in a way that makes them seem at least moving to some extent, I hope, to be fair. But if you feel moved by these kinds of considerations, like zombies, possible worlds, the contingent nature of these identity statements, and that kind of stuff, then what are you going to do? You're faced with the option of either taking epiphenomenalism or doing something else. Well, if those were my options, I would side with Russelian Monism. It gets the best bang for your buck for people who are really motivated by these kinds of arguments, and so therefore think that current physics as we understand it right now is leaving the consciousness out. Okay, so see you next week.
Hello. You may have heard a certain creature in the background of various of these recordings at some point here, and that little creature is one who has Frankie here. This is her bone. And we just thought we'd take a minute to say hello. Say hi, Frankie.